to In Focus with Ejaz Heather. Iran and the remaining parties to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action met again today in Vienna with talks aimed at returning Iran and the US to the 2015 nuclear agreement. But things may not be easy during this round. Last Wednesday, discussing the talks in Vienna between Iran and the remaining parties to the JCPOA, we had reported that while a breakthrough wasn't imminent, both sides were approaching issues in good faith. A day earlier, on 6th April, two working groups were formed. One was to list the US sanctions that would need to be lifted, while the other would gauge what measures Iran needs to take to return to full compliance with the accord. The 6th April in-person meeting was followed by a joint commission meeting last Friday. European diplomats were also keeping the US team briefed. That was lodged in a different hotel because they were not directly involved in the talks. Since then, other developments threatened to derail the talks. There was an explosion at Iran's Natanz nuclear facility on Sunday that knocked out power to the facility and damaged unknown number of centrifuges. Work for now has been stopped at the facility. Iran has blamed Israel for sabotage, and a number of other sources, including in the Israeli and the US media, have pointed to the possibility of Israeli hand. The Israeli newspaper, the Jerusalem Post, has in fact pointed directly to Mossad chief Yossi Cohen in an article yesterday titled Mossad's Cohen Doctrine on Iran, Never Stop. The article begins with the line, underground, above, doesn't matter, we'll get you. The US has indicated that it is not involved in any covert activity against Iran's nuclear facility. Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has said that Israel played a very bad gamble if it thought that the attack will weaken Iran's hand in the nuclear talks. Zarif was addressing a press conference in Tehran with the Russian counterpart Sergei Lavrov. Zarif also blasted the European Union for slapping sanctions on 8 Iranian security officials, a sentiment also voiced by Lavrov. Meanwhile, in a letter to the IAEA on Tuesday, Iran said it will start enriching uranium up to 60% purity. Both the Natanz sabotage and Iran's warning have cast a shadow on the multinational talks. To discuss the situation, I am joined by Dr. Setareh, Sadeqi, a Tehran-based researcher and political analyst, Dr. Kamran Bokhari, Director of Analytical Development at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy. Let me begin with Dr. Kamran Bokhari here. Kamran, it's clear, obviously, as you know, this is something on which no one leaves a signature. But it's fairly clear from reports emanating, as I said in my opening, both in the US media as well as in the Israeli media, that Mossad had some hand to play in what happened in Natanz. It had some hand to play in what happened in the assassination of Fakhrizadeh. Then, of course, the famous operation that dealt with the nuclear archives. So it seems that Tel Aviv is going on with its policy of somehow impeding and destroying Iran's program, even as other powers try to get back to the deal. Give me your sense of what's happening.
So, Ejaz, in an article back in late November in the Wall Street Journal, after the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientist, Mr. Fakhrizadeh, I pointed out that Israeli intelligence has deeply penetrated Iran's nuclear industry. In fact, in order to be able to penetrate the industry, you have to have a sufficient amount of penetration inside the country with assets, cutouts, and the ability to execute operations undetected. So that's the reality. And as the Biden administration has resumed negotiations, they're now at the public level, although they're not bilateral yet. They're still in the multilateral framework. The Israelis are basically coming out and signaling to the world that, look, Iran's nuclear program, there are other ways to deal with it. You don't have to negotiate from a position of weakness. And, the bargaining power of the Iranians is being slowly eroded, at least at the level of perception. So at the end of the day, the issue isn't, the nuclear program. That's a leverage that the Iranians have in order to be able to get out of sanctions. And that is if you will, the framework of the conversation. But at the end of the day, what matters for every actor, including the United States, is Iran's disproportionate amount of influence in the Arab world. And that is what Iran seeks to preserve and its opponents seek to erode.
Okay, now I'm going to get back to that, the Iranian play in the greater Middle East, but just to sort of bring the focus back to the narrower issue of the nuclear capability. Now, Iran has constantly been saying that we do not want a bomb, but the Iranians continue to develop a missile capability that seeks to, include the IRBMs and even longer range missiles. Now, clearly, from a purely strategic point of view, it's it's very difficult to understand that you want to have a missile that you're going to fire at a distance of 2,500 to 3,000 kilometers with a tactical warhead. It does not really make much strategic sense. What do you think about that?
The bigger question to ask here is that, there is a reality that we know for a fact that no country that has developed nuclear weapons capability ever did it by telegraphing to the world that they were doing so. Iran is the only one that is actually doing that, and it's been doing that for years. In fact, a couple of decades now. And so one has to ask, what's really going on here? What is the nature of the program? And then, of course, what is the true capability? You can't just keep processing uranium and then hope to have a deliverable weapon one day. There are several steps in between, technological steps. You have to be able to produce enriched uranium up to 90% purity. B, you need to be able to have a sufficient amount of fissile material. And when you do, that's all you have. You have fissile material, and then somehow you need to, put it in a box or whatever it is, and you have a crude bomb that maybe you can, use in a test somewhere and showcase to the world that, hey, we've crossed that threshold. Then the question is merging that nuclear weapons technology with ballistic missile technology. And that's another feat of engineering. So what I'm trying to say here is that, yes, one should have no doubt that the Iranians, if they were capable of, would achieve a nuclear deterrent. But we really need to pick apart where they really are. And the reason for that is that the Iranians are using that as leverage to extract all sorts of concessions from, the international community.
That's a very interesting thought. Let me pull in Dr. Sadeqi here. Dr. Sadeqi, what are your impressions of the Israeli hand in the Natanz explosion and the talks going on in Vienna?
Well, I think Israel most probably was aiming for a much greater sabotage in Natanz, but it didn't turn out to be as major as they wanted. So probably that's why they are hesitant in declaring or taking credit for what they're doing. But it has been very clear since the nuclear talks started between Iran and the major powers that Israel greatly opposed any kind of a deal between the two, between Iran and the major powers in the world, because Israel naturally feels an existential threat, which mistakenly it looks for the source of the threat from outside when it is coming from inside, and a regime which has been established based on occupation of Palestinian land, and a regime who has and openly has a nuclear arsenal and is not a member of the NPT, is saying that it is worried about Iran developing nuclear weapons, which doesn't really make any sense. And as you know, that the nuclear deal, or the JCPOA, was also meant to increase the supervision of Iran's nuclear facilities. The International Atomic Agency had for several times verified the peacefulness of Iran's nuclear program, but during the JCPOA, as President Obama at that time said, the most supervision or inspection regime was imposed on the Iranian nuclear facilities. So there is no doubt in that regard that international communities, international bodies have been monitoring Iran's activity, and they haven't really found anything that significantly contradicts the international protocols. So it seems like what Israel is worried about is Iran's more leverage, Iran's more progress in the region and more power, and possibly stronger allies in the region.
So one of the things that the Trump administration was worried about, and let me say, and I think Dr. Kamran Bokhari will corroborate this, even among the Democrats, there are a number of people who do look at Iran's influence in the greater Middle East, and they do believe that by lifting sanctions, they will be providing space to Iran for actions and activities that are detrimental, as per their assessment, that are detrimental to U.S. security and the security of the U.S. allies in the Middle East. So that's their perspective. On the Iranian side, and I base it on my conversations on this program with various Iranian analysts who say that what is the guarantee that even if Iran were to get back to the deal and the U.S. were to walk back into this deal, that the next administration will not just walk away again. So there are these two perspectives that are difficult to reconcile. So how do you look at the situation?
Well, I think, as you also said, Israel and the U.S. are really worried about a stronger Iran in the Middle East because not only they fear Iran's influence and power, but they are also fear that without punishing Iran for standing strong in the region, for being independent, and for developing economic and scientific abilities inside, if they do not punish Iran for what it's doing, they fear that other countries will also take Iran as a role model and follow in the footsteps of that country. So the fear is not only the Iranian influence, but also the Iran setting an example for other nations in the region to be independent and to stand against U.S. bullying and coercion.
Okay, let me go back to Kamran Bokhari. Kamran, what are your thoughts about which way this will pan out? The warning that we are going to enrich uranium to 60% purity, the fact that there's been the explosion at Natanz, which obviously has set back the program again. What do you think are Iran's options? What exactly is the play here?
I think that, look, regardless of their agenda, their expansionist design, the fact that the Islamic Republic of Iran is a very radical state in terms of how it wants to redo the regional security architecture. Let's set that aside and let's just assume, accept the fact that, all actors are rational. So if we go by that principle, then you look at this process very differently from how it's generally seen in the media. Iran knows that at this point, even if, let's say, this 60% is accurate to the letter, even at this level or even before this level, it's facing attacks, intelligence attacks on its infrastructure and personnel. Now, Iran knows well that if it were to get closer to the threshold, to cross the nuclear Rubicon, then it has to assume that there will be airstrikes from Israel and perhaps even from the United States. I mean, it just depends. But the Iranian calculus has to factor these things in. So what does that mean? That means is that they're not going to rush to that threshold. And right now, eventually they will get there. They're not in a fast track process to get to the nuclear threshold. Right now, the entire purpose is to use this as a threat, as a bargaining chip, as a lever to say, if you don't work with us, this is what is going to happen. So yes, it does draw everybody into conversations, and the Iranians have a hope to be able to get back to at least the JCPOA, because right now the Iranians have a dilemma. The dilemma is that they have peaked out in terms of how much they can project influence overseas, which is significant, but it came at a cost. The cost is domestic tranquility at home in terms of the political economy. To maintain its position on the foreign policy front and not have an erosion of authority at home, they need that reprieve, the financial reprieve. So that's where they're going right now. The problem is that if you go along with this logic, today, or tomorrow, there may be JCPOA version 2.0, but then down the road, it sets into motion a chain of events that can eventually get not only Iran sanctions relief, but also, a further advancement on this path towards nuclearization. So again, nuclearization is a long-term goal. For now, it's being used to extract concessions, but it's not just concessions. It's both. It's the actual thing and its utility as a bargaining chip.
It's interesting that you mentioned an attempt to have preventive attacks in the event that the Iranians decide to go right up to 90%, because I believe this was last year. I had Mohammad Marandi on this program, and I asked him, this was when there was this fear that there might be a shooting war between the United States and Iran. And he said that, and he was very clear about this, he said that we have a targeting strategy and we are going to lay waste Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. Now, I believe that this is more than just bluster. So I'm assuming that the US or Israel or any other power that might want to take out the Iranian nuclear program is likely to factor this in.
I mean, just as I said, I apply the same logic to the other side. So if the Iranians, as I said, know that if they keep going at it and they become more aggressive, then they are inviting potential airstrikes. So they have to factor that in. Therefore, the U.S. and the Israelis have to factor that in as well in terms of the Iranian retaliation and response. So these are one of those things that, here at the Pentagon, are gamed out, and there are contingency plans. So I have no doubt that no one here is naive enough to think that, if they'll just do airstrikes and that's the end of it. No, I mean, obviously there'll be a cost to going down that route, and which is why nobody wants to go down that route. And it's a very, very difficult situation. There are no good solutions. And again, that's why the maximum pressure is that you negotiate, but you negotiate from a position of strength where the other side is willing to forego other things, not just, we'll stop enrichment for X number of years and we won't produce this kind of gas for, again, X amount of years, and so on and so forth. There has to be far more robust sanctions. Again, speaking empathetically and doing empathetic analysis, I get it. The Obama administration was trapped in a situation and had to walk away with a deal. and hence their decision, which became the JCPOA. But I don't think that that necessarily is the same thing that constrained Trump. Certainly not. We saw that. And I don't think that the Biden administration is constrained either, though the Biden administration is trying to find that sweet spot between the Obama position and the Trump position.
That's going to be a tough call, but Kamran, stay with me for the European perspective. I also have Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler, the diplomat, is currently coordinator of the 1267 Sanctions Committee and was first secretary political at the German embassy in Tehran from 2006 to 2010. Dr. Schindler, thank you for being on the program, obviously discussing the multinational talks in Vienna, but also the two developments. One, of course, the explosion at Natanz, which Tehran has blamed Israel for, and the letter written by Tehran to the IAEA saying that they're going to, enrich uranium to 60% purity. So now it seems that once again the atmosphere is vitiated as far as the Vienna talks are concerned. So give me your perspective on what you're expecting out of these talks.
Well, I mean, it's from a European perspective, of course, a very positive development that these talks have started. As you may remember, the European started off as the E3 negotiating with Iran because there's a deep-seated belief that a diplomatic solution with objective limits on the Iranian nuclear program is preferable to another regional military confrontation. And we've been going down this route now for several years, and now in a second attempt to find a more sustainable diplomatic solution. So in a way, it is absolutely positive that these talks started. However, given the domestic situation in Iran, and I'm not referring necessarily to the attack last weekend, but the presidential elections in Iran in June, there is a very low expectation of major progress before this election is over. Obviously, the regime will not allow an outgoing president and his power center to have a major foreign policy success. So I think everyone is quite impatiently waiting for June to be over, and then hopefully taking successive steps to go back into an agreement, which I may add is a Security Council resolution under Chapter 7, and therefore an actual legal obligation on all member states, including all members of the Security Council.
Now, Dr. Schindler, you've said something very interesting, so let me just take you back to that. You said that the regime is not going to allow the current president and his lieutenants to have a foreign policy success. Now, in the event that the hardliners win the presidency, what guarantee there is that Iran would still be interested in carrying on talking to the Europeans and the remaining, powers that are, treaty partners in the JCPOA?
I think it's no secret that there's always been similar critical voices towards the JCPOA as there were in the US and Israel, saying inside the regime that the country has given up too much for far too little. These voices, of course, were not weakened by what happened in 2018. However, I can still see that there is a fairly broad support among all other factions within the regime to return to an agreement which allows Iran to still have the technology, but puts limits in place that prevent it from going into a military-oriented program.
Okay. Now, one of the things that the Trump administration was saying, and there are a number of Democrats also that subscribe to this, is the Iranian power projection in the greater Middle East, also the Iranian missile capability. Now, the European Union itself has slapped sanctions on 8 Iranian security officials, and only yesterday, Javad Zarif, during a joint presser with Sergei Lavrov, blasted the European Union for doing that. And Lavrov also said that if this has happened while the talks were on, then it's criminal. I mean, that's the term that Lavrov used. So it seems that while the European powers do want to get Iran back into compliance, and also get the U.S. to walk back into JCPOA, they are also no less concerned about certain other actions of Tehran. Is that sense correct?
Absolutely. And I think it's a common misperception, deliberately or inadvertently spread by those critical of the regime, of the JCPOA, that the JCPOA would prevent any kind of sanctions. This is absolutely not true, and it's very clear in the agreement that sanctions under the JCPOA that are relieved and where the promise is not to reinstate them only and exclusively relate to nuclear-related matters. Sanctioning on Iran's abysmal human rights record, sanctioning on aggressive regional behavior is by no way, shape, or form precluded in the JCPOA. So what the Europeans did was a reaction of what we saw at the end of 2019 to ensure that there's a clear signal that there is a certain behavior that whether the negotiations are going on or not is simply not acceptable from a European perspective. I quite frankly cannot understand the Russian statement on this, because they also have signed up to this agreement and they know its contents.
Right. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Hans-Jakob Schindler. Thank you also to Dr. Kamran Bokhari for speaking with us. We shall take a short break and return to discuss the evolving situation in Afghanistan. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. U.S. President Joe Biden has announced September 11 as the date for the complete withdrawal of U.S. troops, though the drawdown of the remaining 2,500 U.S. troops will begin by May 1st, as stipulated in the U.S. Taliban deal signed on 29 February 2020. Meanwhile, Taliban have said they won't be able to attend the multinational talks in Istanbul if they are held on 16th April. Their reason? We're still discussing our strategy internally. The date for the talks in Turkey hasn't been finalized yet, and given the Taliban statement, it is unlikely to be finalized without an agreement by all sides, especially the Taliban. But let's dive right into our discussion of the evolving situation. I'm joined by Maryam, an Afghan activist and analyst, and Rahimullah Yusufzai, resident editor of the News. Maryam, cutting through all the sort of, diplomaties and other niceties, the fact is the U.S. is getting out. The fact also is that so far there's nothing on the table. And the fact also is that it's unlikely for the appetite of the U.S. and its allies to keep funding the regime in Kabul. So it seems that the situation is akin more to the glass half empty than the glass half full. So give me your thoughts on this.
I think that the fact that Biden has been very clear on him leaving Afghanistan is a great position for the Afghans to understand what they have to do next. I'm quite disappointed after the announcement to see the kind of messaging that has been going viral on social media, talking about the violence that is going to be especially towards women. I don't think that we're taking into perspective that we've had many Afghan warlords who were Mujahideen fighters who committed more atrocities, who are now in power, and many of these activists who are sharing these images and trying to continue to spread fear amongst the public, sitting with those warlords. Then you also have the fact that the Afghan citizens, it hasn't sunk into them that what does it mean that the Americans are going to completely withdraw? Because right now, the Afghan National Defense Security Forces for the past several years have been taking all the fights forward. The question here remains is the kind of financial support that would be provided to the Afghans after the Americans leave. The other things is on Taliban. The internal rift that they have and the fact that they're not coming to talk to the Afghan government and other stakeholders who might be present in the Turkey conference shows that there's a problem within the Afghan Taliban, and we have to actually focus on that a little bit. I think that some of the Taliban leadership believe that they're winning the war, and there's some who actually are exhausted of the war, because many of the foot soldiers who did enter the cities during the ceasefire were expressing how they're exhausted of the war, and they're only in the war due to financial incentives because they couldn't find any other economic opportunities. So there is the problem within the Afghan Taliban that we have to actually reflect aside from that, we have to also look at the fact that the Afghan public is not the same public in the 90s. The public that was fighting and fighting and fighting and just exhausted and stuck in their home, especially when it came to women and children. Now these people have had education opportunities. They've interacted with international parties. They've seen the different light of Afghanistan. So you can't control a public that has access to internet, a public that has created a voice, and a public that has seen opportunities. So it's going to be, I don't think it's going to be the same brutal way of governing back in the 90s, because I feel that the public is much more stronger in regards to their own defense. There are going to be atrocities, I'm well aware. There are atrocities right now, even with the Ghani administration happening, because the Afghan government is stretched really thin, fighting the Afghan fighting the 22 insurgent groups, not to mention how strong ISIS is in Afghanistan, also fighting the Afghan Taliban, and then trying to keep law and order. What kind of law and order when we have constantly a major individual assassinated on a weekly or monthly basis in Afghanistan?
Okay, Maryam, with prejudice to what you're saying, and frankly, personally, I hope to God that you are absolutely right with reference to the fact that a lot has changed since the 90s. But here's the thing. Before the PDPA moved in, ousted Dawood, killed his entire family, Kabul and some of the other major urban centers of Afghanistan were very westernized, very secular. Women were highly educated, but none of that prevented Afghanistan from spiraling into utter chaos. And the emergence of the kind of, savagery that we saw. So all I'm saying is that simply the fact that in the last 20 years, we have an entire generation of Afghans that have grown up with modern technology, that has modern sensibility, does not really prevent Afghanistan from going back into, a savage mode.
When Afghanistan would spiral into chaos, it always had to do with the fact that there was a foreign entity involved. When Afghanistan, the issue here is that the Afghans have never sat down eye to eye. Originally, when President Bush interjected into Afghanistan, the Afghan Taliban wanted to be a part of the Bonn conference, but because of the Patriot Act and they were on this vengeance for revenge, they didn't care to provide them a seat at the table. There's always a way to move forward, and it has to be negotiation. Foreign countries cannot be policing our internal matters because it's never going to work out.
I completely agree with you. Just to remind the viewers, Pakistan was constantly at that point saying that the Taliban should be included in the Bonn conference, but that did not happen for reasons that Maryam just mentioned. Thank you so much. That was Maryam Wardak speaking with us. Let me go to Rahimullah Yusufzai. Rahimullah Yusufzai, how do you look at these new developments, and can you find something positive in this, or how do you look at this?
I believe that the dates for the Istanbul conference have been decided. We have heard that the conference will be for 10 days, beginning on 24th of this month until May 4th. So I think 16th of April, which was the original date, that was cancelled. And one of the main reasons was Taliban were not willing to attend at that stage. I think even though they were a bit skeptical about this conference, but eventually I believe they will attend. This is a big conference, inter-Afghan conference, and they're very close to Qatar. Qatar is, attending the preliminary meetings in Istanbul, which has come up with the 9-point principles for the Istanbul conference. The US, UN, Turkey, and Qatar, they attended the conference. So I think if Qatar persuades Taliban, if Qatar insists, Taliban will not say no because Qatar is the host. Also, I think every country with a stake in Afghanistan will now try to convince Taliban to attend the Istanbul conference, including Pakistan, China, Russia. And I think, Taliban will realize that by not attending, they will be seen as anti-peace, that they are not interested in the peace process. So they will, I think, attend, but maybe after this 10-day conference, which I don't think will lead to a major breakthrough, maybe some principles will be agreed upon. But eventually, I think that the conference may shift again to Doha, where Taliban feel more comfortable. So I think that, Taliban have these two grievances or demands or whatever. They say that the U.S. committed to release the remaining prisoners in the Doha agreement and also to remove the names of Taliban leaders from the UN security blacklist. But I don't think that, the US or Afghan government will agree to that before the Istanbul conference. But maybe some guarantees will be given to Taliban during the Istanbul conference. And maybe after that, some of these prisoners will be released and some of these names will be removed from the blacklist. But I think that, there is still hope. And that's why there is so much of focus now on the Istanbul conference. And, these 9 principles have been delivered to the Afghan government, to Taliban, to all the stakeholders. And they are discussing it to prepare for the Istanbul conference. So I think the conference will take place. And, 10 days is a long time. Maybe they can agree on certain things. But, this will not be the end of the story.
President Ghani is also, he's prepared a paper, and there are 3 broad points, and then under each point you have 4 or 5 sub-points. And he plans to take that paper to the Istanbul conference. Apparently it's also been shared with the US. So what do you think of that paper by President Ghani? And we had actually discussed this in a previous program, and there was a sense that it's not very different from the draft that was circulated by the Biden administration. So give me your final thoughts on this.
I think that, these points are valid. These are important. They need to be discussed. They're almost similar to the American proposals, but, Ashraf Ghani wants to have his own peace plan, a roadmap for peace. And, as they say, this should be an Afghan-led, an Afghan-owned peace initiative. So that is the principle. But let me add that, whatever Ashraf Ghani proposes, Taliban would not accept that. Taliban would not like to give any credit to Ashraf Ghani.
That's something that that thing that they have made quite plain constantly. But thank you so much. That was Rahimullah Yusufzai speaking with us. Before I wrap up, let me go to Dr. Riffat Hussain, who's joined us as Head of Public Policy at the National University of Science and Technology. Dr. Hussain, thank you for being on the program. So September 11, final withdrawal, drawdown will begin from 1st May. And the Istanbul conference, as Rahimullah Yusufzai just pointed out, has been finalized starting 24th April. So give me your sense of whether you are optimistic about the evolving situation or whether there's still room for pessimism.
Ijaz, there are 2 things which are very important, and one had not anticipated. The first thing, which is the American decision to unilaterally withdraw all of its forces before the 20th anniversary of 9/11. And the second thing was that we were not sure whether the Istanbul process will take place or will be on track. Even though a lot can happen, a terrorist attack can subvert the process. But I think the third implication is, which is very important, is that by announcing the American unilateral withdrawal, the Americans have given a tremendous victory to the Taliban, and they are already celebrating that we have beaten not one but the second superpower also, and from there they would like to be in the driving seat, and that leaves out all the plans that were presented before the which are going to be presented before the Istanbul conference, whether that's the Gully plan or the condition-based withdrawal, which was the existing mantra. But all bets are off. So I think it is the situation on the ground which will determine what happens finally to the American withdrawal process. But what the Americans have done is there was a review process, and the Biden administration's consensus was much against the assessment of the intelligence community as well as the defense community that we should not be waiving or leaving Afghanistan to the tender mercies of the outcome of the war, which is quite evident. The Afghan have got a major victory, diplomatic and hopefully a military victory. But there is one thing which I am very worried about it, and that's the Saigon analogy, which we in today's New York Times they said Biden was also talking about. Before the American forces left Saigon and Vietnam in '75, there was an intense period of bombing of the Ho Chi Minh Trail, North Vietnam, and and I hope that the same mistake the Americans will not repeat when it comes to their withdrawal, because they have made it clear that if there is any attack, significant attack on the withdrawing American forces, then the Americans will respond forcefully. And by forcefully means it could be a combination of air power, drone attacks, and something like that. So that is something that I'm worried about.
Right, that Operation Frequent Wind is a good harking back to a disaster. But my own sense is, and I would like to get your take on this, that since the deal in Doha on 29 February 2020, there has been no attack by the Taliban on U.S. troops or U.S. allies. They've been, obviously attacking the Afghan national security forces, but not the U.S. troops. And there's not been a single U.S. casualty. But finally, give me your sense, Dr. Hussain, of how the Taliban are going to look at it, because one can approach this from two different perspectives. One is that the Taliban say, okay, September 11, every U.S. troop will have gone back and the field will be open for us to take on Kabul. The other possibility can be that Ghani realizes that he needs to stitch a deal with the Taliban before September 11. Which side of the proposition are you likely to fall?
Well, I am more inclined to agree with the first scenario rather than with the second, because the Taliban's effort will be to further marginalize the role of the Ghani government, as was correctly pointed out by Rahimullah Yusufzai in his comments, and they would not like to deal with the Ghani government, and they would not be following his peace plan logic, which essentially means that keeping himself in power and having a ceasefire agreement. But all of this will depend on what kind of guarantees the Taliban would like to demand from the U.S. when during the Istanbul conference. So we have to wait till the end of the Istanbul conference before we make the final judgment. But my sense is that I would like to endorse the first hypothesis based on my experience of having studied these things.
Absolutely, I agree with you that we'll have to wait until after the Istanbul conference to figure out what exactly is likely to happen. But thank you so much. That was Dr. Riffat Hussain speaking with us. This is all from In Focus this week. We shall see you next Monday at the same time. Keep following our latest updates on social media at indus.news. And yes, given the third COVID-19 wave, both in Pakistan and across the world, stay safe and follow the non-vaccine safety protocol. Good night and goodbye.